The only way to make sense out of change is to plunge into it, move with it, and join the dance.
Are you ready to make the most of the only life you have? To make smart money choices focused on achieving what you care about most? Here to help you balance living well today without sacrificing your tomorrow is the Retirement Answer Man, Roger Whitney.
In so many ways, retirement and living independently later in life was easier for our parents and our grandparents. Back then, the majority of people were covered by some type of pension from the company, and that social contract still exists. Even as late as 1983, 62% of employees were covered by some kind of pension. Now, fast forward to 2013, and it's like 13% are covered. So we are approaching a whole new landscape of retirement. This is going to be the first generation that is retiring without a pension of some sort. Plus, we're going to live so much longer. We're dealing with the rapid change of healthcare and technology and skills and how we live. It's an ever-changing landscape. So for you to thrive, and for me to thrive really, is going to be, we're going to have to know how to manage change more than ever before. And if we're not willing to do that, and if we're not willing to accept that, I think we're at risk of not living or thriving like we could later in life. This is one of my biggest beefs with financial planning and with how everybody, individuals and my industry, approach retirement, is that we're still using a paint-by-numbers approach to help you solve your financial problems. And it's not just planners. I think the media is. We think of it as a paint-by-numbers approach, a very structured approach with very little creativity. And a lot of times that leads to only bad choices. And it's going to be only by you and I being willing to think and be creative, to move outside the lines of this paint-by-numbers approach, that we're going to really create a life where we can thrive outside of the lines of how most people think about retirement and how most people plan for retirement. Now, Brad, a client of mine, we're having a discussion, and he was recommending a book for our list that we're putting together on the best financial and non-financial books. At the end of the month, I'm going to have that PDF created. So if you still have some book recommendations of books that have had a great impact on you, just shoot me an email at roger@wwkllc.com, and I'll compile that. I got a ton of books. I'm so excited to, one, put it all together so I can see them, and two, share it with you. But Brad recommended a book called Who Moved My Cheese? And that was one that was recommended by a number of people, which is a really simple book. If you see it, you could read it in one sitting for sure. And I think that story really encapsulates what I'm talking about when we talk about how everybody thinks in a paint-by-numbers approach when they plan their life in retirement, when we really need to be outside those lines. So if you don't know the story Moved by the Cheese, I'll tell you real quickly. There are 4 mice in a maze. There's Sniff and Scruffy and Him and Haw. And they live in this maze, and one day they set off to look for cheese, and then they find this box in the maze that just has a ton of cheese. So every day they scurry on over and they just mow on the cheese. Well, one day, Sniff and Scruff arrive, and there isn't any cheese left. Now, they had noticed that the supply was dwindling, and they were prepared to go hunt for more. So off they went to go hunt for more. Later on that day, Him and Haw arrived to discover the same box, the empty box where cheese had been, and they were disappointed because they were used to the routine of going and getting their cheese at the same place at the same time every day. In fact, they were mad. I mean, how unfair that this cheese is not there for them. Meanwhile, Sniff and Scruff ran off and found a new spot of cheese and got into a whole new routine because they had recognized that there was another spot to go. Now, Him and Haw, well, what did they do? They him and hawed about should we go search? I don't know. Do we go? I don't know. I like this box. I always come to this box. I know where I'm going. I'm a little afraid to go search because they were so comfortable in their routine. Well, Haw finally wises up and decides to go look. Writing on the wall for him who hadn't been there, if you do not change, you can become extinct. Hawk keeps asking himself as he's scared, going on this new journey to find this new place where the chi is. He keeps telling himself over and over again, what would you do if you weren't afraid? What would you do if you weren't afraid? You'll have to read the rest of the book for yourself, but when we're talking about change management and we're talking about how do we thrive outside the lines, you got to ask yourself, what would I do if I weren't afraid? We're going to talk a little bit more about this, and I think we have the most impactful interview I've ever had on this show, so I'm so excited to share it with you. But before we do that, we have to have that all-important disclaimer. All right, here's the deal. Don't take advice from me on the show. I don't give investment advice. I don't give planning advice. I don't give any advice to you on the show. I work as a financial planner, and I give advice to clients who I work as a fiduciary for because I know them. I know enough about them to give appropriate advice. I don't know. And, really, you don't know me either. So before you make any decisions, talk to your financial advisor, your legal advisor, or your tax advisor, because that's just common sense. Now, what is this about? All this change going on. Let's talk about the retirement crisis that we hear about in the Hot Topic segment. Well, in the news recently, the National Institute of Retirement Security issued a report about the retirement crisis in the United States and surveying people 50 to 64. I have to look at that. 85% of Americans are concerned about retirement. 55% of Americans are very concerned about retirement. We're not feeling too good about the prospect of being able to live out all those beautiful pictures we see in the retirement brochures. Those in the 55 to 64 bracket, they are the last age group that still have a majority of them covered by some workplace pension, even though they know it's not enough to take care of the entire equation that they're going to have to deal with. Now, here's a scary number that they came up with, or found, was that nearly 45% of working age households have no assets in a retirement account. When we look at retirement account balances, we got a median, so this is like right down the middle, age 55 to 64, the median retirement account balance is $100,000. 45 to 55 age category, it's $60,000. That's what we're talking about when they talk about the retirement crisis. Now, you couple that with the cost of healthcare in retirement, the fact that we're going to be living a lot longer in retirement, the fact that we're going to want to be more active and spending more money in retirement, that's a crisis. Now, it's a crisis especially if you use the paint-by-numbers approach that everybody uses in their mind and financial planners use of, I have to build this humongous war chest so when I retire, I can just draw from it. It's all about building that war chest of investment assets, that one-dimensional way of thinking of things. In that mind frame, it's a crisis, and in some ways, bluntly, a lot of us are screwed. So the question is, are there more solutions to that than just simply that paint-by-numbers approach? And that's what we're going to talk about with my special guest here in a little bit. But before we do that, let's get to the what does that mean segment, and let's define a very important word when you're thinking about your life and you're thinking about living more independently.
Huh? What does that mean?
In the what does that mean segment, where we take a term and we define it so we understand how to use it better when we're thinking about our life and planning for retirement, it's a word that you've heard before. And I'm going to be honest with you, this is now my favorite word, and the word is thrive. So in the verb form, thrive means to become, to continue to be successful, strong, healthy, things like that. Now, it comes from the Old Norse word, and I'm going to screw up the pronunciation, no doubt, thrifask. Thrifask. I don't know if that's how you say it, which means, and this is what I love, to grasp, to get hold of. Now, the retirement crisis today is a lot like Who Moved the Cheese. We're still using a process that brings us back to the same box, but unfortunately, that's not the box that really allows us to thrive. It's moved for many of us, and we don't know where it is. So we need to think differently about how to find it if we want to thrive. And I think that's a really important word. When we're thinking about living more independently or living in retirement, that should not be something that you settle for, that you hope, that you scrimp by on. That should be something that you grasp, that you get a hold of in a successful, strong, and healthy way. And I truly believe we can do this if we think outside the lines. So about 2 weeks ago, I came across this new book that came out called The 100-Year Life: Living and Working in the Age of Longevity. And we've talked about longevity before. And it was written by Linda Gratton and Andrew Scott. So I went and picked it up. I think it was released in May of this year and was blown away by the book. It talks about exactly what we've talked about on the show. And what I think you know intuitively is that this paint by numbers approach isn't working as well anymore. And ultimately, it's going to be gone. And we got to figure out a new approach so we can thrive in our later years in life. So as I was reading this book, I'm like, man, I got to get these people on the show. And I was blessed enough to get Andrew Scott to have a good conversation about what they see from their level. Now, let me explain who Linda Gratton is and Andrew Scott. Linda Gratton is a professor of management at the London Business School, where she teaches an elective on the future of work. And she is ranked in the top 15 in the world by Business Thinkers 50 and was named the best teacher of the London Business School in 2015. Hey, not bad chops, right? Now, Andrew Scott, who we have a conversation with here in a few minutes, he is a professor of economics at the London Business School, a fellow at All Souls College at Oxford University. He's taught at Harvard and the London School of Economics, and he has served as an advisor on macroeconomics to a range of government and central banks. So they got the chops to back it up, and this is an extremely well-researched book. So after I was done talking with Andrew, I told him, it's like, Andrew, we talk about a lot of the same things, but you talk about it like you're in the Pentagon in the strategy room where all the super smart people are. And I talk about it more like the captain or the lieutenant that's down on the ground and getting all dirty. So I think this is a good talk about how to think a little bit outside the lines so we can learn to thrive as we get older. So let's get to this conversation with Andrew. So Andrew, when I picked up your book, The 100-Year Life, that's a little scary, isn't it, when you think about living to 100?
Yeah, that's a response most people have. It's kind of funny because the main message we tell people is the data suggests on average you're living for longer and you're healthier for longer. And in response, people go, oh my goodness, I'm worried, which is strange because it should be good news.
The picture that brings to my mind was my grandmother who passed away last year at 96. And her living that long, she was sort of the last person standing. Everybody had died around her, and it didn't seem like a full, rich life right near the end. And hopefully that's not what it's going to look like for us as this longevity curve keeps continuing out.
Yeah, no, I agree. And then there's so many issues there to pick up on. I mean, one, as you say, last one standing. And of course, if you look at the number of people who are aged 100 today, it's like 1% of the people who were born 100 years ago. The data suggests that if you go forward in 70 years' time, it'll be 50% of your cohort will still be alive. So that'll be different. The second thing is, I think that we naturally tend to go straight to that point where we're old. And obviously, we don't like to think of that point. But, the thing that we say is that this is really about longevity rather than aging. Aging tends to be about end of life. And we think longevity is about all of life. So we have more time when we are healthier than our previous generations and fitter than previous generations. And that's not just about end of life issues. That has implications right the way through life, whether you're 20, 40, 60, or 80.
In a lot of ways, it changes that perspective of this long, strenuous march to retirement, and then you can relax that, no, you're going to be around a while. It might be a long journey that you should enjoy the whole way.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons why we think people, when we point, when we talk to people about this, we ask people, how many of you thought how long you might live for? And what's interesting is, that's a very difficult question to address both statistically and psychologically. So most people say, I haven't thought about it. Only about 1 in 3 of the people I ask have actually thought how long they might live for. Then when you ask the people who have thought about it, what do you base your guess on? They say, oh, my parents or my grandparents. And of course, what the data suggests is that every generation is living about 10 years longer than the previous generation. So you're probably going to live 10 years longer than your parents and possibly even 20 years longer than your grandparents. So, we need new life models. And that three-stage life of education, work, and retirement, the natural inclination is to assume, well, if I'm living for longer, I'm going to have to work for longer. I'm going to have to be working in my mid-70s or even early 80s. We reckon if you're in your early 40s, you're probably going to be working to your early 70s. And if you're 18, you're probably working to your late 70s or early 80s. And that just sounds terrible. Extending that second stage, that working career, sounds remorseless. But the point is, you don't just have to extend that second stage. There's lots of things you're doing. And we think there's whole new stages of life emerging. And one of them you're already seeing, because clearly retirement is no longer the hard and fast concept it was before. The age at which people stop working is now very varied. Most people now, a significant number of people also work after the usual retirement date. So we're getting a kind of a fuzzy concept of retirement.
So I'm a practicing financial planner, and I exclusively work with people that are in that, 50 and older model. And a lot of what we hear about the retirement crisis, there's a lot of issues there, but it's because we're thinking in a 3-stage model, right? That we have to kill ourselves and then retire and then we're used up. So it's that old way of thinking.
What's interesting is that if you look at the 20th century, you saw two new stages of life emerge. One of them was teenagers. For most of human life, we just had children and adults. And in the 20th century, we literally invented teenagers. The other stage of life we invented was retirement. People previously used to work until they died. And that wasn't a happy story because as people got older, they got more frail, they got less productive, they got paid less.
And that wasn't long ago.
No, exactly. Well, it was a big labor movement to introduce retirement, but we created this wonderful third stage. But it was created with the assumption you'd retire around 65 and you might live to 70. And, our thesis is that really how we structure time, how we structure life, is a social convention. We've structured it around a life expectancy of 70, but my kids have a plausible chance of living to 100. So we can't just stretch our existing life structures out over 100 years. We need to redefine them. And already, as you said, that's changing for people who are 50 to 60. And, what you're seeing, one is now a decision whether or not to retire at, say, 65, and people might want to work for longer. That then raises, I think, a whole bunch of really interesting questions for people, because then your role when you're advising people around retirement is not just about their finances. I think this is what's very interesting to me because, in a 3-stage life, if you're living for longer and you've got low interest rates, people just say, well, you've got to save more. But of course, there's a whole range of other options, which is you could work for longer. But then if you're going to work for longer, do I want to? Do I have the skills to work for longer? Do I have the fitness to work for longer? And so all these decisions are about a much broader portfolio of assets than just your financial ones. It's your skills and your knowledge. It's about your relationships. It's about your health and fitness, as well as about your finances.
And a lot of it is reframing work as not an either or. I either work or I'm retired. When you get into this multi-stage concept of maybe it's working, but gaining more freedom and independence.
Exactly. And I think a number of things are happening which are really interesting. The first is, when life expectancy was high 60s and we retired at 65, retirement really was about the last few years of life, perhaps taking things easy, and then becoming frail. Now, if you're retiring at 65 and you're living to your late 80s, that's 20 years. And you can sort of imagine that perhaps for those first 10 years, you're actually very fit and active. And so you might want to cruise, you might want to do all sorts of things, but one of the things you could do is work. And then, of course, you have the more traditional stage of retirement when you're more physically frail. So retirement itself now is made up of different stages. And that first stage has lots of different options. And working is one of them, but you may not want to work as hard as you've done before. You may want to have a better work-life balance. You may want to do something that's more blending fun and work together, perhaps do something more entrepreneurial. So there's a lot more options around than there used to be.
And if we think of these multi-stages, and you talk about this in your book, which is a great book, by the way, it has blown me away. One, because I preach a lot of what you've written, but you have the the intellectual and academic chops to back it up with tons of research. But it has implications on, like you said, investing in your health, investing in your skills, in your relationships. I mean, it becomes a very different dynamic, doesn't it?
It really does. And, I think there's so many things that are changing. And I'm stressing that longevity is about all of life. So here's a few things that I think are changing. One is the average age at which people get married is now much later than it used to be. So back in the 60s, 50% of Americans were married by the age of 21. That's now more like 28. So we're sort of postponing things later. I think you're seeing a new age group emerging after the teenage years. Secondly, if you're in your early 40s, you probably will have to work to your early 70s, given your life expectancy and your pension. That's another 30. That's another 30 years. So, kind of, how are you going to do that? And you're seeing a lot of people take mid-career breaks or shifts. And then the final thing, I'd give, which is UK data, but I suspect it's very similar in the US. Divorce rates are falling in general, but they're rising for 50-year-olds, 60-year-olds, 70-year-olds, and 80-year-olds. In fact, in the UK, the fastest growing age group for divorce is in people who are in their 80s, which just speaks to this effect of longevity and how it creates whole new issues as well as options.
And that creates issues in turn. I mean, I just celebrated my 26th wedding anniversary.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you. And one of the big implications I see is, as a practicing planner, is you want to blow up some of your finances, have poor relationships later in life, and have divorces. So that need to nurture those relationships is stronger than ever before. Now, one thing I want to go back and hit on, because I see this in America. I've taught part of the Certified Financial Planning curriculum, which teaches the process for retirement planning. And it's still modeled around that 3-stage life: education, work, and then retirement. In your second chapter, you talk about if you stay in that mindset, it could be a curse because you have to kill yourself so long in that second stage of work.
Yeah, so one of the frameworks we look at in the book is we kind of think about looking at a dashboard. Imagine you've got a dashboard in front of you. Is that the right word?
That's a good word.
And I've got 4 dials in front of me, and those dials are recording my assets. And we think you got 4 distinct categories of assets. One of them is financial. It's your savings and your pensions, and can you afford to retire? But in order to support a good life, it's not just your financial assets, it's what we call your intangible assets that matter. And those intangible assets are often ignored. And we think there are 3 types. One is what we call productivity assets, your skills and knowledge. A second, which is really important, we call your vitality assets. And this is both about your mental and physical fitness, but also critically about your relationships with close friends and family. And study after study from social science tells us that what makes for a good life is the ability to love and be loved. It's about family and friends. And then the third category of intangible assets, the 4th in total, is a new one. We call them transformational assets. This is your ability to deal with change, because in a longer life with many stages, you're going to have to get better at dealing with changes.
That's a very important point, yes.
Yeah, absolutely. And, talk about even divorces in your 80s. It's about how you deal with change. Now, one of the challenges is in a 3-stage life, we think of that second stage as just getting our finances right. And if I'm going to live for longer, it's fairly obvious I need to retire later. And that solves the financial problem. If I work for longer and I carry on saving, then my financial assets on my dashboard are looking good. But of course, if you're 20 and you're going to have to work to your late 70s, early 80s, that's a 60-year career. So if you think about what's happening in your intangible assets in that work stage, you're running down your skills and knowledge because you're not learning things. And when you have a 30-year career, that may be that what you learn in your early 20s can get you through your career. Right. But I doubt that's the case going forward. So, if you're in your mid-40s and you're going to have to work to your early 70s, are the skills you learn from school from so long ago, are they still relevant? Do you need to upgrade given what's happening? And just carry on working is going to run down your productive assets, your skills and knowledge. Then, of course, there's your health and mental fitness. If you carry on working intensively, that affects your health. You probably won't have a 100-year life. And it certainly affects your relationships if you're at work all the time. You can't buy a lifelong friend aged 80. And if you've been working 60 years, will you have the friends to support you in retirement? Will you have a good relationship with your husband or wife or your children? So, and then the third thing is your ability to deal with change. If you carry on doing the same thing, you don't invest in that ability for change. So my worry is in trying to make the three-stage life work for longevity. Sure, we solve the financial problem, but we're not looking at your skills and your happiness and your ability to deal with change. And they're the things that we really have to invest in, or else it does become a curse. You're just stuck on a treadmill, becoming possibly ever less relevant to work in a job that you enjoy less and less, in a way that's not helping your relationships outside.
So I imagine that the sooner you get out of the three-stage mindset, especially if you're in your 40s or 50s and you're worried about this retirement crisis, because what happens is if you stay in that mindset, then you start to get depressed and feel unempowered. Whereas if you can break out of it, all of a sudden you can be active in thinking about solutions.
Exactly. But it's difficult, but you're absolutely right. And we do find, it's that age group who particularly respond in a positive way. And we are trying to be positive because we do believe that if we're living for longer and we're healthy for longer, this should be a good opportunity. But it does, I think, serve as a wake-up call for someone in their, say, mid-40s, because you have 30 more years ahead. And I don't know many people who are happy to carry on working on what they're doing at the intensity of what they're doing for the next 30 years, which then raises some quite stark questions. Well, then, how do I change?
Well, in that stage, so my wife and I'm 49 and she's 29 plus undisclosed. In that stage where we're empty nesters. So that might be the first stage of all of a sudden we can, we're redefining, okay, what is our life? And maybe we simplify and reimagine, because that's probably the time once you've completed that raising of the children that you can think of restructuring and imagining what you'll be doing.
I think that's absolutely right. And it's a trade-off too, because it's also a time where you want to just rest and relax and enjoy and sort of have some leisure, but you also need to use that time to invest in your future self. That's what I think is different about each generation, because they're living 10 years longer than their parents. If you follow the footsteps of your parents, then you're, as it were, relaxed too much rather than spend your leisure time in reinvesting in yourself, recreating yourself.
And then on the opposite end, I'd be interested in your impression, because when I was reading about this, it made me think of my niece who's in her mid-20s, and she's been traveling the world.
Yeah.
Doesn't really have a career yet, isn't married, and it's easy to say, what a bum. But maybe they're getting it. That younger generation is getting it, where we just don't understand it because we're in that three-stage mindset.
I think that's right. And, one of the triggers for the book, or at least the way the book went, was my own children. And, one of them graduated from a good school, good college, got a good degree, and just said, Dad, I'm not going to get a job. And it, met with incredulity on my part. What do you mean? And it took me a while to work it out, and also realize that part of me was just jealousy. It's very interesting. I think what we're seeing is the age at which people take on what have been traditionally the full responsibilities of adults is getting later and later. Buying a house, buying a car, having kids, getting married, starting a career. I look at pictures of my father, when he was 14. Mm-hmm. He looks old. He's wearing a suit and tie. He's got a job. He's paying rent. He's married at 17. He's got a house at 18. He's got kids at 19. And my goodness, that's responsibilities early.
Yeah.
But of course, my generation was later, and my kids' generation is even later. And I think, from my father's point of view, you might say they don't have any commitment.
Right.
But one of the things I thought about in the book is that what is happening is when you have more time, options become more valuable. So, you can buy options on a share, and the value of a financial option becomes more valuable for the time period over which you can exercise it. And I think that's what's happening with the younger generation. There's some negative factors too. It's harder to get jobs. Houses are more expensive. So they've got student debt. There's negative factors driving some of this. But I think there's also this longevity. And they are aware they have more time. They're aware they have more options. And just as the 20th century saw the emergence of teenagers, I think we're seeing a distinctive pattern of behavior of people in their 20s. They're not starting their careers as early. They're learning about themselves. Blend work and leisure together. It's kind of a bit like what you're seeing in people in their 60s who are being entrepreneurial but in different ways. They're blending work and leisure together.
I think in an optimistic perspective for that generation we're talking about, it'll be interesting because when they do start to enter that normal work stage, they're going to have such a more depth of experience and perspective than, me and you coming out of college. You're not coming out of college.
I agree, and I think you're already seeing. I'm not a great fan of the phrase millennials. I don't like the idea that people are different just because of the year they're born in. I think longevity is. I think this is a group who are just realizing about their longevity in some intuitive sense, and you're already seeing the challenges in the workplace because I think if you commit later or that you have many stages to your career and you're not going to work in this company forever, then questions about who I am and what do I value become much more important. I think, in a short life, a lot is determined by where you start from. And over a longer life, it's a lot more about the choices you make and the life you craft. And I think we're seeing something of that in these 20-year-olds who are coming into the workforce and saying, why should I do this? I don't value that. And it is causing some tensions in the workplace.
Now, so for the audience of the Retirement Answer Man podcast that are in their 40s and 50s, any parting words and advice to how to rethink this 3-stage life?
Yeah, I think the first is, you should be really excited about it because this is fantastic. But be careful that you're not been following in the footsteps of your parents and think you can retire at 65. Because if you're living 10 years longer than your parents, you probably can't afford to do that unless you've been saving a lot. And of course, the current low level of interest rates make that a challenge. So first of all, be aware this is great, but you've got to be good at change. And then it's about doing an inventory, not just of your financial behavior, which of course is important, but just about whether you think that your working life can extend for another 25, 30 years without more investments in education and skills, or perhaps shifting into a role or a job that you find more fulfilling and more exciting. And that's about being open to new ideas, because one of the challenges we have as we get older is the people we hang around with become more and more similar to ourselves. And that's not always a great support network for introducing new ideas or encouraging people to change. So it's a great time to talk to your family, your close ones, but also take stock and think there's a lot more life to come. How do I position myself for that?
Very great words to part with. Thank you so much, Andrew.
Thanks. I had fun.
Now it's time for our Smart Sprint segment.
On your marks, get set.
Well, in our Smart Sprint segment, where we set a 7-day goal to do something that will help move us forward in this journey towards independence and retirement, I'm going to give you a book assignment. Yep. And guess what? I want you to read Who Moved My Cheese. I haven't read it in probably, it feels like 20 years until Brad brought it up to me. I'm going to go reread it. And I suggest that you go reread it and think it from the lens of what are we thinking about that has moved on us, that we need to start noodling on where the heck that has gone so we can learn to thrive as we start walking this journey towards retirement. Because we're going to have to master being a navigator of change as we get older, probably more than any other generation. Now, let's talk about how to be happy, eh? Hey, welcome to the Happy Lab, where we noodle just for a few moments on how to, live a happier life now and in the future. So I promised my wife I would tell the story. If you've been a long-time listener, you know the trouble I got into the last time I talked about my wife and something in the Happy Lab, but this one's okay. She gave me the blessing on this. So we just celebrated our 26th wedding anniversary about a week and a half ago now. And when I woke up, there was this gift basket and, a beautiful card. And when she came home, I had gotten her the same type of thing. I got her, something that she didn't ask for. See, this was smart. She didn't ask for, but I heard her say she wanted this. It was a holder for her iPhone, like an armband while she was exercising. I just randomly heard one day, man, I wish I had one of those. And I listened because I'm a good husband. I try to be. So I had gotten her that. And then I had gotten her a card because in years past, I had gotten her a thoughtful gift, but without a card. And I learned that the card is almost more important than the gift. and what you write in the card. So I'm like, okay, I'm not going to forget that. So I'm running around during the day. I get the card, and it's, the Lady and the Tramp. Remember that Disney movie where they're sitting behind the Italian restaurant and they're eating some spaghetti noodles? And then so the picture on the front is, they're both sucking on the noodle, and then the inside fold on the left side, they're a little bit closer. And then the last one, oh, they kissed. And it says, something like, you mean more to me than ever before. So when I bought the card, I read the front. And I didn't read the left panel, but I read, you mean more to me than ever before. Love you so much. And so I bought the card. So I put a nice personal note in it, wrap it up, put her name on it. So she comes home, she opens it, and it ends up that middle flap that I didn't read said happy birthday. So it wasn't an anniversary card. And that was like the first thing she saw. And she looked at me and says, dude, do you realize this is a birthday card, not an anniversary card? And I'm like, yeah, but I underlined, we're closer than ever before. See, did you read my note? How sweet that was? And so we had a good laugh about that. And I guess my point is, in this Happy Lab, is when you're investing in your spouse or in other people that you care about, and you're doing it very thoughtfully in little conversations, when little things like this come up, that's something you can laugh about together, and it's not a big conversation. I had enough built up with her that she gave me grace at the fact that it said happy birthday and anniversary. So make sure you're always making those deposits. So when you deserve grace or need grace, it's going to be there for you. I want to thank you so much for the show. I would love to hear your thoughts on what Andrew shared with us on the boxes and how that's changing. So go ahead and send me an email on that. Now, I know a lot of you are worried about this election, which is a couple of weeks away now. So next week's show is going to be the election show. Right before the election, we're going to talk about what do we do impact-wise? What is this all going to mean if Trump wins or if Clinton wins or if whatever happens? So we're going to have a show about the election to hopefully give you some perspective so you can make better decisions. As always, it is a joy to spend this time with you. I am Roger Whitney, the Retirement Answer Man.
We appreciate you joining us today for this episode of Retirement Answer Man. Be sure to visit rogerwhitney.com/answers to access the Retirement Answer Library with over 30 checklists to help you make the most of the only life you have. Remember, you have more power than you realize to create an amazing life starting today with Retirement Answer Man. The opinions voiced in this material are for general information only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual. All performance referenced is historical and no guarantee of future results. All indices are unmanaged and may not be invested into directly. Have a wonderful day.